Hi, this is Lili Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. I appreciate your joining me today for a review of sections 23 through 26 in the Doctrine and Covenants. These are relatively short revelations. In fact, some of them were combined, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I just have to say again, things are absolutely fulfilling the prophecies of the latter days and the last days, or as President Nelson reminds us, the last of the last days. Things are nuts. I mean, I can't keep up with it. I don't know how many of you are even trying, and there are certainly other things to occupy our time. We do live in the world. We have obligations and families and good things to take care of, tough challenges to address. So the news, may not come first, and it can be so negative that I'm not against that. I do find myself sort of, trying to keep up just because, as I've said before, I've always been fascinated by sort of the sociological approach to this that my parents always took. And again, that was my undergrad degree, and I really enjoyed it, even though it's not really very worthwhile in the market. It was a good beginning. When I went back to school, it was useful to have that degree finished so that I could follow the Lord's commandments to me to go back to school. At any rate, from a sociological point of view, this stuff is fascinating. And we see that, as my parents used to exclaim occasionally when we were discussing things as a family, and they would share their insights and analysis of things. They were brilliant people. But sometimes as they would be making the sociological aspects kind of blend in with prophecy and so on, and then they would exclaim with, this kind of enjoyment that was really fun to see. They would say, like, God is a sociologist. And and that was kind of fun to grow up hearing that occasionally, but it obviously extended to everything else. God is a biologist. God is a rocket scientist. God is, the best at human behavior and so on, which is why it just sort of stuns me. We talked about this a few years ago when there was a temporary tempest that was going on with a woman who called herself a Mormon sex therapist, and I don't even want to repeat her name right now, but she was eventually asked to then participate in a disciplinary council by her stake president because she was making very outspoken media posts and so on about criticizing the church leaders and things that were completely contrary to church doctrine, while using the appellation of a Mormon therapist. So eventually, I believe she was excommunicated. But at that time, there were a lot of human behavioral specialists, I suppose. I mean, of various kinds, but most of them were therapists, most of whom were Latter-day Saints. Some were former Latter-day Saints. But about 6 of them got together and composed this several-page letter in defense of this woman and saying why they didn't think it was appropriate to challenge her membership. And then it was signed by like 600 others. And anyway, it was ridiculous. It was ridiculous. And in the letter, I remember, I don't even know if I think I did read the whole thing, but Chris and I went through it. And the first page, there was something just right off the bat that really made me so sad and frankly a little disgusted, because I saw them writing there that as a mental health professional, in other words, here she was a licensed therapist, so apparently she's above the gospel, and it said that therapists need to default to research and that is their necessary emphasis. Well, again, I mean, there is something to staying up with current research in the field that you practice within. However, they go on to say that in the letter, they went on to say that they try to help their clients find, well-being either in or out of the church. And again, I'm paraphrasing, but one statement mentioned specifically that some of their clients found that they were going to be happier outside membership with the church. And I remember Chris and I talking about this and saying, how absurd is that? Like, those people don't believe that God is a sociologist. Those people don't believe that God is a human behavioral expert. They don't believe that the Word of God includes more benefit for human flourishing than any other resource anywhere in any universe. And that just stunned me. That hubris just kind of stunned me that they would put that in print and put their names to it and find 600 other people to sign it. I mean, think about what that means. And we're going to talk about pride here in a moment, but that's just this incredible pride and hubris that, oh, some of our people are going to do better outside the church. No, they're not. Nobody ever does. Now, they might have misunderstandings of the doctrine that prevent their feeling completely comfortable. And I found that many times with clients or friends or others, who were like, well, I'm not very comfortable with this. And I say, like, yeah, well, neither is God. And here's exactly what the doctrine really says. And they would be surprised because sometimes the gospel really is the best kept secret in the church. So it could be misunderstandings. It could be a lack of information. And of course, it can be a lot of other things as well that people use as reasons, quote unquote, reasons to leave. But frankly, it seems so flippant, for these people to so flippantly suggest that human behavioral research is going to, help our people, our clients do better, some of whom will find out that they do better out of the church. Anyway, that just is ridiculous. So, sorry, long story there, but it's amazing looking at what's going on in the world. And I really miss having Chris here to talk about it because we used to really enjoy and, sometimes weep over the things that are fulfilling prophecy. But at least we can see that the word of the Lord is always fulfilled, and he does know everything. Why we continue to contest that reality is just to our detriment. Couple of things that I'm going to mention in this part one, and then we'll get to part two and mention something else here, but it's hard to select what to look at. This one did catch my eye. The current administration canceled $400 million in federal funding that would have gone to Columbia University, of course, which is a prominent Ivy League school, right, over its inaction to combat rampant anti-Semitism on their campus. Now, this has been in the news now ever since the terrible day of October 7th, 2023, where there was that attack on Israelis. And we still have some hostages being held by Hamas to this day. It's been over 500 days that these hostages have been in captivity. Of course, we've seen the release recently of some, and thank God for every release. But this has been a barbaric situation against the Geneva Convention, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, but Columbia became a hotbed right away. Not the only school, incidentally, but one that was in the news quite a bit because the anti-Semitism protests or anti-Israel protests, pro-Gaza, pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas even, have been really extreme on this campus as well as a few others. And one of the assistant professors there at Columbia, who's Jewish, and his name is Shai Davidai, has been in the news recently for calling this out. Now, he was actually removed from his teaching responsibilities because he did make a big deal about the on-campus protests where they do these encampments and it's not even, hygienic or whatever. And the students leave a disaster around with all kinds of garbage and destruction in their wake. They took over a building that first time, and I think they've done that again recently, I don't remember, but they've also harassed Jewish students directly and prevented their attending class and so on. These demonstrations have become somewhat violent, and they passed out all kinds of flyers with anti-Israel and pro-Hamas talking points. Now, Hamas is a terrorist organization, however you want to slice things, Hamas is a terrorist organization. So to have these students who are supposed to be the recipients of world-class education coming up with these approaches or even conclusions is disheartening, to say the least. Anyway, this Professor Davidai reported recently that it's been quite a while since he's been unable to be on campus. He's been barred from campus, and he's still employed, apparently, and I guess he's still receiving his paycheck, but he wanted to get some books from his office and asked the university if he could come onto campus to go to his own office and get some of his own books for use at home. And they denied him that option. And then he asked if his wife could be given permission to go and retrieve those books from his own office. And they denied his wife access to campus. So anyway, he's been calling this out. They did have to replace the university president because she spoke before Congress with, I think it was the MIT president, and what was the third one? I'm going to forget. But another prestigious, supposedly prestigious school. And they were terrible in their responses, acting like they couldn't even condemn the anti-Semitic behaviors and so on. So a couple of them have been replaced. One of them is a Colombian, and now they have an interim president. So I don't know if she's going to remain, but she did kind of respond to this canceling of the $400 million in grants to Columbia University. So again, so often it comes down to money, find the right lever and a place to stand and you can move the world, right? So she is at least saying, this new interim president is saying that she's willing to work with the administration to make sure that they're satisfied with the efforts Columbia is making to protect Jewish students, etc. Which, you think? You think maybe that's a good idea? Like, this used to be America, right? Where people didn't get attacked for who they were. Like, I'm not saying we haven't had our problems. I mean, I get it. There was slavery, there were bad things that happened in America, but we're supposed to be past that, and here we are. Our university students at some of these elite universities are attacking Jews. Like, this is such regression, and then nobody does anything. But now maybe something will happen. Now, Professor Davidai also made a point about a statement that maybe you've heard before. I've heard it before. First, they come for the Saturday crowd, and then they come for the Sunday crowd. Now, what does that mean? Well, the Jews are the Saturday crowd, meaning they attend synagogue on Saturday. That is their Sabbath, and so that's the Saturday crowd. So first people come for the Saturday crowd, and then for the Sunday crowd, meaning the Christians. And we certainly have seen this in the past. Another phrase that has been used to describe anti-Semitism or to comment on it is that in some respects, Jews are the canary in the coal mine. Now, in case you're not familiar with that phrase, I'm sure some of you are, but this was something that coal miners used to do, and they did it until the late 1970s or so, and they started to change the policy. But it was a long-standing safety measure that coal miners would take a canary into the area where the miners were working because canaries require a lot of oxygen. So if they passed out or looked sick or sluggish or whatever, the coal miners would know that they needed to get out of there in a hurry because there was too much carbon monoxide being produced in that space. So that was their safety factor. It was a litmus test or, an early warning signal for humankind that, if the canary can't handle it, then you're next. So same idea that the Jews end up being kind of the canary in the coal mine. And it's ironic that people don't get that they think that it will stop with harassing the Jews. But again, many commentators have pointed out with great legitimacy that these protesters that are anti-Israel and anti-Jew are also, after death to Israel, it's, a heartbeat later, they're saying death to America. They'd like to bring down Western civilization, and they are pretty open about that. So it seems ironic that this hasn't sent off an alert to more people. In fact, I don't have the numbers here, but I saw this just this morning, I believe. Apologize for that background noise. My radiant heat has been making a ton of noise. And I do have somebody coming to work on it again, but I'm not sure they know what to do yet to make that noise go away. So at any rate, I apologize for the background. The study that I saw this morning reported that for the first time, there was fewer than 50% of Americans were strong in their support of Jews/Israel. And that is a change. Of course, our politicians have been varied on their stance in that respect, although America has historically been pro-Israel. Nevertheless, we've seen some prominent politicians really change that historical policy and advocate for something different. Nevertheless, the American populace has been pretty consistently pro-Israel, and now that number is dropping and dropped below 50%. So that was sobering and sad. Now, along with all of this, 8 of the released hostages were invited to visit the White House and came recently to visit with President Trump and shared some of their stories of captivity with President Trump. And he got really upset again. I realized that, anyway, some of the language is pretty rough that he posted after this. This was his final warning to Hamas, based on the fact that they are still holding 59 hostages from the original 200 plus that were taken. I think it was around 250, wasn't it? But anyway, 59 hostages remain in captivity. However, intelligence sources are saying that only 24 of those 59 are still living. That's their best understanding of the current situation. But Hamas is still holding the bodies of 35 other captives who died in the hands of Hamas. And one of those that they think is still alive is an American citizen. So Trump posted this, "Shalom Hamas," he said, which means hello and goodbye, you can choose. Release all of the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. Only sick and twisted people keep bodies, and you are sick and twisted. I am sending Israel everything it needs to finish the job. Not a single Hamas member will be safe if you don't do as I say. I have just met with your former hostages whose lives you have destroyed. This is your last warning. Now, he does throw out a carrot along with a stick, and he says, we can rebuild Gaza. And all the people who have been in Gaza or remain in Gaza or have fled Gaza temporarily, he said, we can make this a prosperous area. So he is willing to support the rebuilding and, in fact, the vast improvement of that area commercially and in providing facilities and job and sanitation and all these things that would make it a pleasant and prosperous location. So he wants people to be able to live there in peace, but he is done with Hamas. Now, previously, he has made those kinds of strong statements against those holding the hostages, but he has in the past said, I will defer to Israel and Netanyahu. But he says now, I mean, he kind of left out that aside or that caveat. So I don't know what he's going to do. And he doesn't tip his hand on some of that stuff. And we don't want things to be uglier still, but like there is something so ugly that happened here with the invasion of those civilian areas of Israel, the kibbutzim, and that peace festival where civilians were targeted and killed and taken. Sadly, there are, as we have seen, times you just can't give quarter to evil. You can't negotiate with terrorists. Okay, I just wanted to quote from Zechariah chapter 2, verse 8. And I was looking this up, and according to some counts, I mean, I didn't go through and count them all myself or read every one of them that was listed, but apparently there are around 100 verses in the Bible that talk about how people will persecute the house of Israel, particularly the Jews, and that this will be to their condemnation. And we've talked a little bit about that promise made to Abraham that those who will honor and treat well the descendants of Abraham will be blessed, and those who don't will be cursed. But this one was an interesting verse, and I really like the language from Zechariah 2:8. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, after the glory he hath sent me unto the nations which spoiled you. And spoiled you, in biblical terms, that means did damage to you. They came in, they conquered, or they ravaged a territory, they took the spoils. So this is not a good thing. It's not like you spoil a child and you shower them with too much stuff and they become spoiled brats. That's not what that language means in the Bible. What it means is that they came in and they did damage. They tried to conquer, they tried to take the goods, they hurt the people. After the glory he has sent me unto the nations which spoiled you. For he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. Honestly, I didn't remember that until I saw that on that list. And it really is a tender expression, isn't it? Isn't that tender? He that toucheth you, meaning those that damage or injure the house of Israel, which right now, the known remnant of the house of Israel are the Jews. He that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. Which is why when you read the promises made to the house of Israel, and again, particularly to the Jews who are the remnant of the house of Israel that are known and identifiable, we, as members of other tribes that are designated in our patriarchal blessings, are also the apple of his eye, which is sweet, right? But he is talking specifically to the Jews because they have been a hiss and a byword, and they have been kicked out of so many places and mistreated, and efforts have been made to exterminate them pretty much from the beginning of the existence of the house of Israel. It has been said before by commentators, which is so true. The Egyptians tried to destroy Israel. Remember, Pharaoh wanted all the male babies to be killed at birth? Egyptians tried to destroy the Israelites, but the Egyptians aren't here anymore as a strong kingdom, but the Jews still are. And then the Assyrians tried to destroy Israel, but the Assyrians are gone, and Israel is still here. The Babylonians tried to destroy Israel, but Babylon has fallen, and the Israelites are still here. And then the Nazis, certainly other countries, did a lot of damage to them with mistreatment and limitations and ghettos and the pogroms, but those administrations have fallen and the Jews are still here. Israel is still here. The apple of God's eye. Okay, let's talk church history a little bit. As I said, these sections are relatively brief, but there's a lot going on, so we're going to give some background. Now, all of this is happening in the months following the formal organization of the church on April 6th, 1830. So in June of that same year, the first conference of the church is held in the home of Peter Whitmer, Sr. And then later in June, Emma Smith is baptized. Right around the time that Emma is baptized, Joseph Smith is arrested and taken to jail on charges of being disorderly. And then in July, the next month, D&C 24 is received, and so is Section 25, which is to Emma. Let's see, do we have a date? I didn't write it down, but for Section 26, also July. So we're just talking a few months after the formal organization of the church, and persecution, which has never not been a part of Joseph's life. That's a double negative, I apologize. But remember, even before he married Emma, there was persecution. Well, Actually, as soon as he started sharing any information at all about the first vision, he was starting to be persecuted right back then. So he has always had opposition. And why wouldn't he? This powers of the adversary tried to destroy him in the sacred grove. Like, here comes this amazing, blazing light of the restoration through the prophet Joseph, and Satan wants to snuff it out. Like we quoted not too many weeks ago, I think in the past couple of weeks, I've quoted from Marion G. Romney saying that too many people try to serve God without offending the devil. Well, that didn't include Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith was willing to go toe-to-toe. Not that he was looking for trouble, but he would not stop fulfilling his divine and foreordained role. I'm going to say the work was divine. Joseph Smith is a man, and we don't worship him, but he fulfilled God's divine purposes in being the prophet of the restoration. And Satan was after him from the beginning. And this was, of course, prophesied, and he's warned, and we're going to hear it again in these sections. But let's just look quickly at some of the actual content of these short sections in the D&C. As short as section 23 is, it includes quick messages and counsel for 5 different men, right? Oliver Cowdery, Hiram Smith, Samuel Smith, Joseph Smith Sr., and Joseph Knight Sr., who had all come to the prophet. Now, this is very shortly after the organization of the church. They're excited. They want to help. What should we do? And they receive, brief but sweet counsel from the Lord. Now, interestingly, in the short verse here to Oliver, he's given a big warning that the others don't receive. Initially, these were 5 separate sections that they had in the Book of Commandments, but because they were just a verse or 2 each, they combined them into this section and included the counsel that was given to all 5 of these brethren. First, I'm going to mention Hiram, who in verse 3 is given just really a lot of reassurance from the Spirit of the Lord, saying, "Thou art under no condemnation, and thy heart is open, thy tongue loosed, and you can exhort and strengthen the church continually." So that's brief, but he's under no condemnation, which is, really, really pretty good when you hear that from the voice of the Lord. Just a quick quote here about Hiram, given by Joseph Smith, and this is recorded in the History of the Church, Volume 5. Speaking to his brother, Joseph once said, "Brother Hiram, what a faithful heart you have got. Oh, may the eternal Jehovah crown eternal blessings upon your head as a reward for the care you have had for my soul. Oh, how many are the sorrows we have shared together." And again, that incredibly poetic tribute given by John Taylor in section 135 after the death of the prophet and his brother. In life, they were not divided, and in death, they were not separated. Hiram really was a man without guile, and he was so faithful to the work and to his brother Joseph Smith. The first couple of verses, though, are to Oliver, and right in the first verse, what does he say? "Thou art blessed and art under no condemnation, but beware of pride, lest thou shouldst enter into temptation." Now, just a quick shout out here. If we have time, we might quote some more things from it, but Ezra Taft Benson gave that landmark address. In fact, Chris used to refer to it as watershed talk called "Beware of Pride." And it's beautiful. Chris actually kept it in his phone. Before it was easy to do that, even he typed it up or something, and he put it in a file because he wanted to be able to refer to it often, and he did refer to it often. And that doesn't mean we automatically don't struggle with that, but it was something that really spoke to Chris about the warnings there and his desire to heed those warnings against pride, which, as we read in the Old Testament, goeth before the fall. So here's something that Brigham Young said about this particular warning. "I have seen men who belong to this kingdom and who really thought that if they were not associated with it, it could not progress. So he's talking about not just Oliver, but others who think that without them, the church will falter, or that they will draw so many people after them that there will be a struggle for the church if they don't remain in the church and stay involved. But Brigham Young continued, "One man especially, whom I now think of, was particularly gifted in self-reliance and general ability. He said as much to the prophet Joseph a number of times as to say that if he left this kingdom, it could not progress any further." Now that's unfortunate on so many levels, right? But can you imagine? Like that is, I've been using this word today, hubris. That's real hubris. To be so arrogant as to tell the prophet of the restoration that if you leave the church, it's not going to do enough, or it'll tank the whole enterprise. That you're essential. Now, nobody's irreplaceable. I've said this so many times over the years, but like if God could replace Joseph Smith, like who do we think we are? Like nobody is indispensable to the work. God will raise up another. He always does. He always has. He always will. So we separate ourselves from the kingdom of God to our own tragic ends. Now, we're grateful that Oliver came back, but let's just look at this a little bit more. Yes, I speak of Oliver Cowdery. He forsook it, and it still rolled on, and still triumphed over every opposing foe, and bore off safely all those who clung to it. And certainly, the kingdom continues. And then here's just a little bit more about some of what happened to Oliver. We've talked about some of this before, but we'll review it again here for a moment. When difficulties arose among the saints in Kirtland, Ohio, in 1837, remember that was the crash of the financial institution that the prophet had helped to formulate, the Kirtland Safe Society, and it crashed. So many people left the church at that time, and this is so tragic. I mean, it was after the great outpouring of spiritual manifestations that happened when the temple in Kirtland was dedicated. Angels were seen, fire was seen at night. I mean, so many incredible manifestations happened. This huge outpouring as a temple was now on the earth again. Not all of the ordinances were restored, but this was a beginning of that part of the restoration, to have a temple to the Most High God. And then the Kirtland Safe Society crashes and so many people tap out. And again, it's the same thing. Like, this is why we've quoted that story of someone coming to Brigham Young when Brigham Young starts building temples in the Mountain West. And remember, even though Salt Lake was the first temple that was begun, it took 40 years for it to be completed because of the incredible work that was done, the size and the scope and all of the complexity of that building. So St. George was completed first and others. But anyway, the first one was there in the Salt Lake Valley where it stands today, under renovation, soon to be completed. It seems they've announced the open house, so it's getting closer. Although it's still a year or so ahead, I guess. I forget what date it was. Anyway, the gentleman that we're talking about came to Brigham Young and said, "Is it wise to build so many temples? Because it seems that when we build a temple," and of course, previously they had had that experience in Kirtland and then in Nauvoo, where the temple was completed with people having to defend the workers with guns because the mobs didn't want them to complete the temple. So shortly after that temple is completed and dedicated, which was after the martyrdom, the saints had to abandon it in order to preserve their lives and preserve the institution of the church. But anyway, so he says to Brigham Young, "Is this a good idea? Because every time we build a temple, it seems that the bells of hell begin to ring." And again, I love this response of Brigham Young saying, "I want to hear them ring again." So we're talking about that today to some extent. There's incredible persecution that comes when the light is given to the earth, because Satan is the temporary god of this earth, and he does have temporary powers associated with it, and he wants to extinguish the light. And that can happen in our individual lives as well. Many of you are aware of this, that when we are trying to do things to help ourselves progress or to do something positive in our own lives, our families' lives, or to build a kingdom, that we can encounter all kinds of opposition. And it can feel that like one thing after another is going wrong. I mean, I certainly have my stories, and I have shared some of them with you. But that's par for the course, brothers and sisters. It's part of our mortal experience. It's part of living on this planet that we are subject to the opposition that comes with it. And the goal is always to overcome through faith and to let that opposition make us more powerful and more strong in our understanding and our trust and our witness of the truth, and to let God consecrate our affliction for our gain. Anyway, this tragic time in 1837, Oliver fell out of harmony with Joseph Smith and other church leaders and relocated to Missouri. In 1838, church leaders in Missouri charged Oliver with persecuting church leaders with vexatious lawsuits, seeking to destroy the character of Joseph Smith, not abiding ecclesiastical authority in temporal affairs, selling lands in Jackson County, which was against the counsel which had been given of the Lord, and leaving his calling as assistant president of the church and returning to his practice of law. Oliver refused to appear before the council, answered by letter. He said he denied the church's right to dictate how he should conduct his life. Again, this is what the warning was about. Beware of pride, and ask that his fellowship with the church be ended, which it was. So he was excommunicated and remained unaffiliated with the church for 10 years, and then was rebaptized in November of 1848 in Iowa. He's trying to arrange to come and join the saints in the West, but before that he became quite ill and died in 1850 of tuberculosis, as we've mentioned before. So really a tragic story. I'm really grateful that he came back. I am grateful because the Lord receives us when we repent, and he received Oliver. But Oliver, such an amazing guy who had contributed so much, and then he falls to pride. How many of us fall to pride? You know, my mom made an interesting comment, I thought, once. Well, she made lots of interesting comments, but here's one of them about some people who become known in the church because they are scholars of some part of the church history or doctrine, and they write books or go on the lecture circuit, and they get a following. And she had seen this happen a few times, and she was really saddened by it because she had read a lot of those books over the years in her own personal study. And she had felt that she had learned from some of these authors who had done so much study and, had seemed to be inspired about putting some things together or whatever. But then she'd see these guys, not all of them, but some of them would fall away from the church or end up excommunicated because they were critical of church leaders or of the church policies. And she commented to me that she said it must be pride. They attain a level of respect and perhaps some kind of followership of people who like their insights and have learned from them and grown in their own spirituality or study, and then somehow that goes to their head, and then they start criticizing and end up falling away completely. And I think that's a really important pattern to be aware of. And certainly these days you don't have to write a book, you just have to have a podcast. And many people do. So we've got a lot of people that I think we can see this in real time, where people might start out with a good intent and they do want to strengthen the church or strengthen the membership, but then it goes too far. They start to get pretty excited about how many people are following them or quoting from them or whatever, and then they start to go off a little bit here and a little bit there. They get a little more extreme, they get more critical or whatever, and there they go, another lemming off the cliff. Like, it's tragic. It's tragic, but this is for everyone. Beware of pride. Plus, I always have tried to remind myself and my own children Like, where do we think our good ideas come from? That's actually a quote of John Pontius. I want to give him credit because I read that in one of his books. But where do we think our good ideas come from? Do we think we invented that idea or that connection that came to us? That was the light of the Lord, the light of Christ that comes into our minds and our hearts and teaches us something new. And then if we're in a position where we get the privilege of sharing that, how grateful should we be? But not puffed up in our own importance that, like, oh, look what I know, but just how wonderful it is to be able to be one of the messengers of God's grace and of his works. So anyway, I could go off forever on pride. Let me just tell you, as a counselor, this has been such a problem in marriage. Now, it's a problem with parenting and children who become proud and sometimes parents, but it's really a problem in marriage. Having to be right, having to win arguments, never wanting to apologize or acknowledge a fault, always being slippery about our response to being found to be incorrect or in error. I mean, it's a terrible thing. I think I mentioned this before, but it comes to mind again that I remember when I was teaching at the Y, after one class, a young woman from the class came to talk to me, and she said, because I was talking about parenting that day, and I mentioned something about acknowledging our faults when we are at fault with our children and acknowledging our mistakes and apologizing if we get things wrong. And it was interesting because she came and said, and this is a nice young woman, not antagonistic or anything, but she just said, but doesn't that undermine a parent's moral authority to apologize to their children? I didn't ask, but I might have asked, well, what goes on in your family? Because it sounds like this is a new idea, but my answer was like, actually, this is where moral authority comes from in some respects in a parent-child relationship, is the willingness to acknowledge when we make mistakes. Like, of course that increases moral authority rather than diminishes it, because I am not going to be a tyrant or a despot who is so proud and arrogant that I will never acknowledge to my child that I did something wrong or made a mistake and then work to correct it. Anyway, it's fascinating how many places it creeps in family life and every other relationship. So beware of pride. It's really good to examine ourselves periodically on that one. Maybe review President Benson's speech on some sort of rotating a schedule so that we are given an opportunity to, again, do some self-examination and reflection and petition the Spirit to guide us in eliminating pride with humility and gratitude, which is a great antidote to pride, to acknowledge who is really responsible for all the good things in our lives. Okay, section 24, we are going to talk about in part 2. As I look at the time, let's save that one for part 2 and end this one. Well, let's see if I can find a nice quote from President Benson to end this with. Yes. The antidote for pride is humility, meekness, submissiveness. I've told you about my own journeys in trying to be completely submissive to the will of the Lord. It's not always easy, but it is always desirable to be humble, meek, and submissive. It is the broken heart and the contrite spirit. And again, as I've mentioned so many times, growing up in the church, we learned to say that phrase very quickly, broken heart and a contrite spirit. But I learned a long time ago in my adult life, maybe the first time that my heart really broke, that a contrite spirit is not automatic. Our hearts are going to break just as part of being on this planet and a part of this mortality, this fallen world where there is heartbreak and there's a purpose for it and there is a balm in Gilead, but it's not applied immediately. But it doesn't immediately bring the contrite spirit. The contrite spirit is a choice. If my heart breaks and I become angry, or if I stay angry, let me put it that way, if I land in anger or bitterness or resentment, then I'm stuck in pride. But having a contrite spirit, being willing to put my broken heart on the altar and ask God to heal it in His time and in His way, then I can develop that contrite spirit in a way that can fulfill the measure of my creation. And then President Benson quotes Rudyard Kipling, and this really is beautiful. It's in our hymn book. You maybe remember these words from, I think it's called God of Our Fathers, known of old. Anyway, that hymn, but it's a Rudyard Kipling poem that is being used for the verses. The tumult and the shouting dies. The captains and the kings depart. Still stands thine ancient sacrifice, an humble and a contrite heart. Lord God of hosts, be with us yet, lest we forget, lest we forget. God will have a humble people. Either we can choose to be humble or we can be compelled to be humble. Thanks for all our prophets and for President Benson's wonderful remarks there. As ever, let us choose glory, let us build Zion, and my deepest thanks to my sweet husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.